From Los Angeles, the home of film and television, this is Film Music Live, a webcast featuring outstanding composers, orchestrators, filmmakers, and more from the world of music for film, television, and video games, talking about their work and answering your questions. Film Music Live is sponsored by the Film Music Network and Film Music Institute. And now the host of Film Music Live, Daniel Schweiger.
Hey everyone, I'm Daniel Schweiger, and welcome to Film Music Live, the show where we get to ask the questions to today's top composers. I'm happy to have you here. If Jigsaw likely had a favorite band while plotting his diabolical death traps, it would doubtlessly be 9 Inch Nails, the iconic industrial group in which future Saw composer CHARLIE CLOUSER cut his rusty, nerve-ripping teeth in his multiple talents as a keyboardist, drummer, and album producer. With work that spread through such other death metal acts as White Zombie and Rammstein that brought Clouser Grammy attention, it was no wonder that director James Wan called upon him to make a memorable serrated mark for Saw, a movie whose cutting-edge approach to death trap horror marked the major Hollywood debut of both diabolical creators. Since then, Clouser's distinctive talent for generating sinister, sometimes playful sounds from the ingenious pits of depravity have graced 6 more official Saw films and any number of fan movies. He's also shown a suspenseful stylistic range outside of Jigsaw's grasp in such scores as Dead Silence, Death Sentence, The Stepfather, and The Collection, as well as creating the astonishingly spiritual score of the sci-fi miniseries Childhood's End. But just as his twisted music delights in getting pulled back into Jigsaw's machinations, Clouser returns to the horrifying franchise that started it all, with a new spin for Spiral. As directed by Saw veteran Darren Lynn Bousman, Spiral graces the series with its biggest budget and prestigious cast in many a steel-toothed moon, as the Sunfather team of Chris Rock and Sam Jackson discover that the infamous vigilante has seemingly resurfaced with a particular plan for their fates and ghastly consequences for the police around them. Just as Clouser put a new spin into his succeeding Saw scores, Spiral establishes its own ghastly sonic identity here, going for a new brand of rhythmic tension and fast-spinning excitement, all while not forgetting to invent instruments that would delight the master of slow death mayhem. It's a Saw film and score that at once restarts the relentless timer on the series while paying tribute to CHARLIE CLOUSER's distinctive brand of ghastly musical darkness that fans know and love. And now, let's welcome a composer who always has a terrifying musical trick up his metallic sleeve. Let's play a game at Film Music Live with CHARLIE CLOUSER. Welcome, CHARLIE.
Hi, everyone.
Great to have you here.
Thank you.
So tell me, just in the beginning, just of your, explorations into music itself, what attracted you to essentially kind of what we could call metallically tinged music, or maybe even confrontational music?
I've always been intrigued by dark and scary sounds, whether they're musical compositions or just weird individual sounds. And, some of my earliest memories of scary music were seeing, Stanley Kubrick's The Shining and 2001: A Space Odyssey, which weren't the scores for those movies weren't strictly composed for the screen, but they had lots of modern classical composers like Georgi Ligeti and Bela Bartok and Penderecki and stuff that I had never really been exposed to growing up, or even in college when I was studying music. So I was sort of studying academic electronic music. So when I first had the doors kicked open to that kind of dissonant, scary, modern classical composers' textures, I really, jumped in kind of with both feet as trying to incorporate or capture some of the terrifying nature of those sounds.
How did you want to express that through your first rock and roll performances or groups that you joined with?
Well, there was always, I was attracted to sort of high production value record making in terms of I wasn't so interested in sort of making like a Ramones record where it's four guys banging it out in the room and it sounds awesome, but it is what it is. I was always interested more in records that had some mysterious quantity to them and something that I couldn't figure out. If you listen to a Ramones record, as awesome as they are, you can kind of reverse engineer how they're done. But if you listen to, Pink Floyd records or the collaborations between David Byrne and Brian Eno, both in Talking Heads and in the albums that they made, like My Life in the Bush of Ghosts and The Catherine Wheel, some of those records I just remember hearing, and I couldn't figure out at my tender young age how they were done. And so that kind of mystique of studio wizardry, studio science, and how that merges with musical creativity, that's kind of what drew me into the working with the kind of artists that I worked with, whether it was, even on like White Zombie and Rob Zombie records, as simplistic as they may seem, there was a lot of sort of studio science behind the scenes of layering drum samples and layering a synth in behind a guitar riff to make it sound sort of turbocharged and that kind of thing. So that's the thread that kind of runs through the stuff I've done in records and working with bands, as well as in film music, I hope.
Absolutely. I mean, and I think, the one thing that made Nine Inch Nails iconic and really kind of gave, you could call industrial music a popular, critically acceptable face was just how beautifully, if you want to use that word, the albums were produced. I mean, just the distinction in sound, you could say the score like quality of Nine Inch Nails. Obviously when you had Seven, using Closer for the main titles, that was what really did it. Even though it was a song or had come from a song, it really helped popularize that kind of approach for film soundtracks. Well, what do you think it was about Nine Inch Nails, just in general, that really took it next level?
Trent is a otherworldly level of talent, but also of skill. So he not only has the creative inspiration to do things differently, but he also has the sort of just the workaday skills on how to operate the equipment and how to work in a modern production environment. And when you have both of those things working together, then you can get the kind of results that he gets. And that was also what attracted me to working with him and to getting sucked into the Nine Inch Nails maelstrom for 8 or 9 years, however long it was, because there was this desire to push the limits of what could be accomplished, not just sonically, but also with the new tools that were coming to the table at that time. This was when I joined the operation, it was in 92 and joined the band officially in 94. And that was kind of the golden era of this transition from the old way, quote unquote, of making records to the new, more modern sort of computer assisted way of making records. And having the ability to work at sort of what at the time was the forefront of high-tech music making was an opportunity that was just too good to pass up. And what makes Nine Inch Nails kind of work beyond just being some sonic art project is Trent's songwriting capability and his ability to use these ugly sounds in a format that's not just some experimental industrial noise mission. And that's kind of rare. I mean, there's a lot of sonic architects and sonic experimenters out there who make beautiful, insane noise. But, of course, in the context of Nine Inch Nails, Trent's been able to render those sounds in a format that is pleasing from a song perspective as well. And that's, I think, part of what makes his approach unique.
Well, obviously we know what path that Trent and Atticus took. I mean, now they've got 2 Oscars under their belt, but you were essentially, to my knowledge, the first band member who became a film composer. What was it like during the process with Nine Inch Nails, where you start to sow your own oats, or you had the idea that, okay, I can be a film composer?
Well, even before getting sucked into the Nine Inch Nails world, one of the first ever music jobs, quote unquote, that I ever had, where I was actually being paid to make music was working for an Australian film composer who was scoring the final season of the original CBS TV series, The Equalizer, back in the 1980s. And he hired me because I was sort of a techno wizard and could operate all the samplers and the computers and everything. And of course, in that era, the setups were unbelievably crude and minimal. And, so it wasn't by any means anything like what we're dealing with now in terms of all the advanced audio production tools. But even at that early stage, working with the 1980s era MIDI synths and keyboards, I was the guy in that operation to sort of create the sounds we were going to use, and then to program the rhythms and make scary noises and weird accent sounds and so forth. Then after a 15-year detour of making records, I actually reunited with that same composer after I left Nine Inch Nails, and we scored a TV series together, and then I was kind of off and running. So it was always in the back of my mind, and I admit to being seduced by the lure of the record industry and having a great time spending time doing that. But it was, film scoring is much like making Nine Inch Nails records, or making, more correctly, the weird Nine Inch Nails remixes and other interstitial bits that I was heavily involved in. The idea of crazy sound design and sonic experimentation is kind of more compatible with film scoring maybe than making pop records or rock records. And it's also just a much more abstract kind of approach. When you're working on records, even as fringe as bands like Nine Inch Nails might be, there's still, you sort of have an intro and a verse and a chorus and a guitar solo, and there's kind of some format that is tempting to adhere to. But in film music, it's just this abstract timeline that is dictated by the story and the action on the screen. So that's just a much more free-form timeline of a piece of music. And of course, the sonic world that you can experiment with is much more wide open than what's practical to achieve in the record industry.
Now, I believe Saw is your first major solo score. How did you get sucked into the movie that would change your life?
Well, it's funny. I often tell the story, and I was recounting the story to my lawyer yesterday, who it was literally through my lawyer, who I'd worked with for many years and who had previously, in our involvement together, just sort of negotiated, a contract for a White Zombie remix or something like that. And I rarely talk to him. Usually it's on my birthday, and often I can hear, steaks sizzling on the grill and ice cubes tinkling in a highball glass and maybe waves crashing on the beach outside his Santa Barbara mansion. Slight exaggeration there. But so one time he called me on a Wednesday that wasn't my birthday. So I knew something was up. There was either some major disaster or some major opportunity. And he was working with James Wan and Lee Winnell. This was, they had a script and a short that they had, sort of a proof of concept short that was basically Amanda in the bear trap that they had shot. And he had been working with them because he could recognize that they were talented and innovative. And they had, he called me and said, I'm working with these indie filmmakers. They have this cool horror film they're making, and their temp score has a lot of industrial music, and they don't want a sort of thematic orchestral Hollywood score. They want an industrial music influence with a lot of hard and aggressive sounds. And so you need to call them right now. And I did, and the rest is history. It was a perfect match.
Wow. that was just my dog called Jigsaw.
Really?
Tormenting me through this whole thing.
Perfect.
We have to let her out. She's trying to get out of her trap, and there she's in the back. The one thing that struck me that was really interesting about Saw that maybe not a lot of fans caught was that, I think for a lot of people, one of their favorite older horror films is The Abominable Dr. Phibes. with again a mad genius who wasn't a villain, but paying back his vision of justice through these diabolical death traps and biblical punishments. Um, I don't know if you're ever a fan of Dr. Phibes, but how do you think that made this different? Is that this isn't like Jason, it's not Freddy, it's a villain who is a super genius who actually views himself as a good guy.
That was, I think, an important twist that kind of helped to set the Saw cinematic universe, I guess it is now. Oh, apart from the more sort of traditional or the bulk of horror movies that came before, because there was, often the bad guy in horror movies he was undead, or he had some otherworldly or supernatural aspect to his character. And what they've tried to do in the Saw universe is the bad guy is just a normal guy who's been done wrong one too many times. And so it sort of straddles the line between like a revenge picture and a straight horror movie. And I think that was a cool sort of different avenue that they went down that helps to kind of set the storyline apart and make it sort of more versatile, because they can, as we've seen, they can sort of invoke copycat killers and that kind of thing. So it's a bit of a crossover between sort of crime drama and horror. And I think that was a key kind of aspect to the character development that James and Lee came up with right from the start that helped to give this thing the legs that it's had.
How did you see the music for the series changing through so many films?
I always try to respond to what I'm seeing on the screen, not just strictly the storyline and the lines and the actors, but the sort of visual impression that the production design and the sets and the lighting and everything are making. And of course, the directors each have their own kind of visual style. The original Saw movie was very gritty and kind of almost had a 16 millimeter kind of look to it. And then in later iterations, for instance, Darren Bousman's style on the first couple of sequels was almost kind of gothic at times. There would be these, sort of a body hanging with lights shining from behind it and that kind of thing. And I would respond both in my choices of the sounds I'm going to use and the melodies and chord progressions and everything. I'm trying to respond to what I'm seeing so that there's not this weird disconnect between the music and the visuals. And in the case of like these sort of gothic type of images, sometimes I would use like choir sounds and like epic rising progressions that I wouldn't have used in the first Saw movie and wouldn't have used in any of the sequels that didn't have that kind of visual tableau on the screen. And, that I've kind of followed the style of the directors as the various directors have rotated in and out of the franchise, and tried to just kind of stay on their tail while maintaining kind of a thematic mode that the Saw movies. So they always sound right, but they kind of swerve to the left and the right depending on what's on the screen.
Now, in the meantime, you also are scoring some very different projects. You do James Wan's terrifically underrated Death Notice, and also I love Dead Silence, the ventriloquist dummy. And again, just a beautiful, majestic, so completely 180 score for, I think, one of the best science fiction things I've ever seen on television, which is Childhood's End. How difficult was it, to be like the Saw guy, but also to be, striving to say, I can do this as well?
Well, there's certainly a risk of kind of being pigeonholed into this ultra dark, ultra evil, ultra heavy mode. So I was really grateful that, obviously James Wan has shown his talents outside of the small Saw world, all the way up to, the Marvel universe. And so I'm glad that he brought me along for his first few forays outside of the Saw universe. And, in Dead Silence, that was almost a fairy tale kind of approach. There was little music boxes and other sort of less intense, less heavy sounds. Even though it does get heavy and violent, there still was an aspect of cuteness or toy-like aspect to the sound that I was trying to get. And that was a huge break from the ultra dark murk of the Saw world. And of course, the movie Death Sentence with Kevin Bacon that James did was more of a straight up revenge pick. There's no evil geniuses. There's just bad people and bad things happening to good people. And so that was another opportunity to not kind of scoop up another ladle full of darkness from the Saw toolbox, but to stretch out a little bit more outside of the genre. And I had great fun doing all of those, and would love to do more things in that vein. And the Childhood's End project was, again, it's such a classic of sci-fi that I had read in like 5th grade or something, or tried to at the time. And that storyline has almost some spiritual elements, as you mentioned, that there's this sort of weird confluence of science fiction and spirituality and mankind's religious beliefs and all that. So that was it was easy to draw from the story and the imagery on the screen and use these sort of rising to heaven kind of chord progressions and things, as like the bodies are floating up into the sky, and it's almost a religious aspect to the sound that would be totally inappropriate in like a Saw movie or a revenge pick. So.
And now we get to Spiral, and it's been a little bit of a break between the last 2 Saw films, and again, I think, Hollywood loves to reboot stuff, but it's rare that even though the first film, had Danny Glover and Carrie Elways, I mean, suddenly you've got a Spiral movie with effing Sam Jackson and Chris Rock. What was your response to that? Like this kind of major upscaling, as it were?
It was... The story that I hear from the producers that Chris came to them with an idea for, here's a way to not just do a Saw 9, but to kind of take a side street from the saga. And, he came to them with, here's my idea, and this is what I want to do. And the fact that Sam Jackson is involved it was like a huge bonus. I mean, everybody... your job is easy when Sam is on the screen, excuse me, because he's just such a commanding presence that you're not going to have to work too hard to reinforce any sequence that he's in. And of course, we've all been waiting for that moment when you can hear Sam Jackson say, hell yeah, I want to play a game, mother. So it was very gratifying to finally get to that moment.
Or I am sick of these MF and death traps on this MF.
Exactly.
What's so interesting about the Saw is I think it's actually maybe the most socially relevant of the entire series because of what it deals, and you think it's going to go one agenda way, but it actually doesn't. So basically, the people you think are the good guys maybe are not the good guys. And again, I think the kind of a big thematic idea in this, and I mean, really all the films, is the idea of time. That the time is like the 2 minutes that someone has to live, or the time that we've got to catch this person, mixed with this whole thing of police corruption. How does that impact your score?
Well, it's always, I do take go to kind of extreme lengths sometimes to create very accurate kind of tempo maps that match very precisely to the picture edit. And in the case of like these trap scenes where time is running out and the victim is getting more and more frantic as the second hand ticks closer to 0, when the trap will be sprung and their arm gets pulled out of the socket or whatever. That the approach that I often take is to have a gentle speed up in tempos, so that things, and I try to make it a little subtle so it's not necessarily apparent right from the get-go, and it doesn't sound like a sort of cartoonish accelerando getting faster and faster. But if you compare like the speed at the end of a piece versus the beginning of a piece, then you notice, oh wow, it really did get a lot faster. But I do take probably too much time and effort to get those maps, those ramps of tempo to be subtle, but to also let things land on critical shots, critical points, and obviously leading up to a big accelerando and then a giant slam when the trap finally slams shut or their arm gets pulled off or whatever it might be. So it's often sort of painstaking, fiddly work messing with the tempo maps in the computer, but it's always I'm always glad that there is this framework that's set out, that is the picture edit, that I can just sort of start hanging hooks on and start nailing 2x4s to it in an effort to build up the piece of music that matches that framework precisely.
Now we'll jump into our audience questions after one more for me. But I think with every Saw film, you just like Jigsaw, you invent something. What did you invent on this one?
This one for Spiral, it was a little unusual because, unlike most of the Saw movies that take place in darkness in some moist hallway with a flickering fluorescent light that's burning out, a lot of the story and action in Spiral takes place outdoors, some of it at like 12 noon on the hottest day of the year. So there's a very different kind of visual feel, sweat dripping down people's faces. They try to deal with the heat and the hot sun. And so that combined with the fact that this is sort of a side street from the Saw franchise meant that I wasn't going to just deploy the same kind of murky, dark, dungeon-like reverby sounds that have formed so much of the framework of the earlier movies. And so that made it, in a way, that was, again, made my job a little bit easier because I can respond to what I'm seeing on the screen, and I can use sounds that are pointier and sharper and shorter and not drenched in some cavernous reverb to make it sound like they're underground. And that made it much quicker to kind of craft a path. One thing that I did deploy on this movie that I hadn't before is this weird instrument called Tio, which was actually built by Chaz Smith, who built a couple of the sculptural metal instruments that I use. And the Tio is very much like a waterphone, which every horror composer has and every horror fan knows the sound of. And it's a waterphone sort of has two frisbee-like pie plates, literally aluminum pie plates that are welded together to form a sort of UFO shape, and then a bunch of rods welded to the edge. And when you strike or bow the rods, the pie plates form the sort of the resonating body, like the body on a guitar. And you can bow those rods and create either wobbly, weird, scary textures or icy, sustained tones. And so this Tio instrument that Chaz built is sort of like a super waterphone. It's mounted on a stand, and instead of the pie plates, he used a 16-inch carbon steel saw blade, which he sawed the teeth off of, and he liked the metal it was made of and the resonant qualities of it, and he welded rods around the edge of this saw blade. So since it was made from a saw, it would seem to be a natural for use in one of these movies. And it creates a haunting and sort of everything from haunting little moans to kind of shrieking, scary high nails on chalkboard kind of textures. And so that was very useful to create accents and sort of ornaments on the score without reusing instruments that have become a traditional part of the Saw sonic landscape.
Right on, Charlie. Daniel just got nabbed briefly by a feller in a pig's mask. So let me hit you with a question here, if you don't mind. Yeah. Could you elaborate on that process of how you frame in a cue compositionally, and then the importance of maybe improvising on top of it? And maybe some of your favorite improvisation instruments of choice?
Mm-hmm. The framing process is basically sort of sitting there in front of your DAW program. I use Logic on Mac, and just, the first sort of phase of work for me is going cue by cue through the movie and basically just listening to a click track against the picture and trying to find the natural rhythm of the actors' actions, their delivery, and also the edits of the picture, and trying to find where the important spots might be that you want a musical phrase to begin or end. And so a lot of that first process is, I might put up just a metronome click from the computer, or just a very basic
I see you now, man. Awesome.
Drum pattern that might be just, me thumping on any old kick and snare sound or whatever, just to give me something a little less boring to listen to than a metronome click. And I will then go into, in the Logic program, you can view your tempo changes as a list. And so I'm literally just going through and adjusting those. I know you can do fancy drawing of lines and graphical editing of tempos, but I've been doing it this way for so long. It's just faster for me to just look at the list of tempos and at what time code point in the movie those tempo change events occur, and just start fiddling with them and manually typing in slightly higher and higher tempos to try to get a musical section to start at one point, gradually get faster and end at another point, but to have that chunk in between not be some asymmetrical length of music, not like 3 bars and 2 beats. I'll always want it to be a nice symmetrical 4 bars or 8 bars, whatever the desired phrase length is. So there's a lot of fiddling of trying to start here, end here, and have it be exactly X number of bars that fit in between them. And it's not exactly glamorous work, and it's a lot of sort of auditioning and typing in of numbers and listening to it and going, that's ending too soon. And once that framework is established, then first of all, you hope they don't come at you with a new, different edit of the picture that's going to throw all that out of whack. But once that framework is established, then the work of coloring in the music becomes so much easier, because now you have these guideposts, and that makes it, once that's if I establish that first, even on pieces of music that are going to be slow and floaty and ambient and not have like a beat or a rhythm that's apparent, I still want the grid, as it were, to be lined up to the picture, so that as I'm filling things in, I'm not sort of wandering in space with no reference point. And that makes the job of coloring in the actual music that much easier. When it comes to improvisation, the first thing I'm doing is the first part of the process is always making some new sounds that I'm going to use on the project. And usually I'll spend, say, a week or so just letting the movie literally loop on the screen on the wall with the sound off as I'm wandering around the room. And, maybe I'm recording the bowed steel sheets or fiddling with guitars and a bunch of guitar pedals to make drones and stuff, not actually recording it against picture, but just creating a toolbox of sounds that I can then pull from and deploy at will as I start to actually get to work on the music.
Now, Charlie, we've got a question from Stefan Hodgnack. Now, you're coming from a music-first background, having spent much of your career in bands. How did having a visual in front of you alter, impact, or influence your composition process in your early scores?
I'm always hugely grateful that the picture that I'm working to forms the roadmap. And as I kind of touched on a minute ago, was that, when you're working on songs making an album kind of in a band sort of format, there's always a question of, well, should we make the guitar solo 16 bars or just 8 bars? You think that's enough? Should we have the intro be longer or shorter? So there's these decision-making processes that a lot of which are reduced or eliminated when you're working against picture, because the picture is the roadmap, and that provides the guideposts. And in computer speak, when you're working in your music composition program, that's where you get your markers from, as opposed to when you're making a record, you're sort of putting your markers in and going, let's see, guitar solo, 8 bars, 16 bars. Let's try it with 16. Maybe we'll make it shorter later. But those kind of decisions become the province of the directors and the picture editors as they're creating the film. So that makes the whole process, it eliminates that crucial first step where you're standing in the middle of the salt flats with endless white plains stretching in every direction, going, should we go east or should we go west? Those decisions are kind of made by the picture, and it makes things a lot easier in the process, to me anyway.
Now we've got a question from the great Mr. Y. Will. He wants to know, will the intro music to Jigsaw with the sped up Zepp motif ever be released? It wasn't on the official soundtrack, and I've been dying for it ever since.
It is. That's, on this time around, usually on a Saw soundtrack album, there's the score, and then there's a few songs which have been sort of shoehorned in there, but weren't created specifically for the project. However, on this time around for Spiral, we worked with the artist 21 Savage, who took samples that I gave him legally, samples from the original Hello Zepp theme, and him and his crew kind of flipped those into this aggro sounding hip hop track, which he has an EP coming out that is also titled something like Spiral Songs from the Book of Saw or something like that. And it's got his track, the hip hop track that has the samples from Hello Zepp that are kind of pitched up and up tempoed, as well as other songs by other artists that also used some samples from earlier Saw scores. So that'll be on 21 Savage's EP, which I thought came out Friday. Not sure. It's on Epic Records, and if you just search 21 Savage Spiral, you'll probably find it.
And on that note, everyone, the Spiral soundtrack is going to be on Lakeshore Records this Friday, so it's coming out. Now we've got a question from David Hand. You have a distinctive voice in the horror film genre. Have you ever wanted to compose a superhero or sci-fi score, and have you had any thoughts as to how such a score might sound?
Thank you. And yes, sci-fi is kind of a more natural, maybe transitional step away from horror, because there's a lot of sort of ethereal and weird sound designy elements in a lot of sci-fi. And although my phone won't probably be ringing off the hook with, Kevin Feige telling me, hey, you're up for the next Avengers movie. But I will say that in the progression of superhero movies, primarily through the MCU, they have really pushed the boundaries. Before the sort of reboot of superhero movies with the Marvel universe, when you think superhero music, you just think sort of dun 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 dun, sort of corny, kind of old school orchestral thematic music. But throughout the MCU and in the of course, starting with Christopher Nolan's Batman scores that Hans Zimmer did, going through the progression of both the DC and the MCU side, they have really stepped outside of that sort of traditional mode of superhero scoring. And the Hans Zimmer's Dark Knight score is awesome and has crazy sound design elements, playing a cello with a razor blade and that sort of thing. And of course, his score for Man of Steel used Chaz Smith, the same guy that builds my metal instruments. He's also a pedal steel guitar player, and Hans employed him to assemble an 8-man pedal steel guitar army and to use many of his metal instruments to contribute to that score. So I'm immensely pleased that the world of superhero scores has kind of stepped out of the traditional sort of kind of corny mode that it was in through the 80s and 90s, and has now kind of put itself on a par with the more experimental side of scoring. I mean, they had Mark Mothersbaugh did one of the Thor movies, and he's Devo. He's not coming from a John Williams place in the same way that many film composers are. So, a lot of the times, though, the level of scrutiny, pressure, and insanity involved in such a high profile property like a Marvel movie or something is sort of like, do I need that? I don't know if I'm up for the pain and suffering that would involve. I'm kind of happy in my own weird little niche over here in the left-hand corner of the room. But that said, I wouldn't hang up the phone.
Well, I mean, at one point they were rumored to be doing a Trench movie, from James Wan. That would seem to be right up your alley.
Hey, I'm up for it if they'll have me.
Now, on that note, we'll backtrack. But Lucius 333, he's from Caracas, Venezuela, would love to know, after Spiral, what is next?
Over the summer, well, I did. There's another movie that kind of got lost in pandemic shuffle. It's just a weird little independent thriller called Eye Without a Face that I scored sort of during lockdown. And it's just a little indie, very small scale movie, but it came out very cool. It has something in common with the Hitchcock classic Rear Window. And it involves a guy who's hacked into all of his neighbors' webcams, basically so he can watch the hot neighbor girl undress and do yoga. But he starts seeing things that he probably shouldn't. And things go horribly wrong for pretty much everybody concerned. So that little movie, Eye Without a Face, is going to be coming to streaming sites in this coming year at some point. And the score was I had a great time doing it. I thought it came out cool. It was very electronic and lots of sort of glitchy noises, no like big strings or epic orchestra sounds at all. So keep an eye out for Eye Without a Face. But then over the summer, I'm going to do my first ever documentary score. And it's without spilling too much, it's a documentary about a confluence of political unrest in the 70s and 80s and an artistic movement and how those two affected each other. And it's a weird angle of something that really happened that I'd never considered. But as I watched the documentary, I thought, wow, I never thought of these events coinciding and affecting each other in that way. So it's a really cool project, and I'll probably be doing that over the summer. And stay tuned for titles and more info as it firms up.
Now, Lionel Cohen would like to know if you could talk about the significance of mixing your own music.
I've always preferred to mix my own music, partly because I know where the bodies are buried. And a lot of times I'm hiding one element behind another element. And if I passed the raw stems or the raw tracks or elements over to another mixer, they may, and this could be a good thing or a bad thing, they may pick one element and raise it or lower it out of perspective with the other elements that are helping to camouflage each other. And now maybe they'd say, oh, I found this one little sound, so I've made that the featured thing. And I would say, oh no, I don't like that sound. It's not supposed, it didn't come out the way I wanted it. So it needs to be hidden and buried against the other stuff. Now that perspective of having another mixer evaluate the stuff and make those kind of decisions, that's a lot of times what people are looking for. And they love that part of the process. And, I wouldn't mind having somebody else mix my music, but a lot of times I'm mixing sort of as I go, and I'll kind of get the mix sort of working. And then if there's a problem I can't solve by just adjusting levels, I'll just record another part. And, for instance, instead of adding a reverb behind a string or brass part, I might use a different string or brass sound and just layer it in quietly so that it sort of sounds like a reverb, but adds some other sort of a weird psychoacoustic effect that is very different to what would be accomplished by someone who's just sitting with the raw elements and mixing them and adding effects and reverb. So I'm always, and this comes from from all the kind of records and remixes that I made. I was always, if you get a kick drum on a rock record sounding pretty good, but it still needs something else, it was a simple matter to just, let me take this electronic kick sound from like a 909 or whatever, a sound that would be totally inappropriate on like a Green Day record or a Rob Zombie record. But when mixed behind the real drummer or the crazy pounding loops that you've added, it can add the effect of you've added bass to a sound. If you'd hear that element by itself, you might say, why is there this drum machine kick drum in the middle of this rock song? But when it's slickly mixed in and merged in so that it can't be heard on its own, it has the effect of being like a super turbo EQ or compression, that you've added this booming sound to a kick drum that would be difficult, if not impossible, to achieve by just turning knobs behind the console. That same kind of approach is what I wind up doing when I'm scoring, and why I kind of, by the time I'm ready to hand it off to someone to have them mix it, it's kind of done. And I'm kind of ready to just print the mix and move to the next and eliminate that whole step.
Now we've got a question from Ozan. Do you still use your modular system, and what's your favorite piece of studio equipment lately?
I do use the modular system, generally sort of in an offline fashion, where, as I was describing, that sort of first phase of working on a film where I'm assembling elements to be used as a toolbox. So there's kind of a 1.5 phase to that, where after I have the tempo grids kind of laid out for most of the pieces of music, and I've kind of decided which pieces will be rhythmic and which ones will be floaty and that sort of thing, then I'll take those rough wireframe structures that represent the tempos of all the cues, and without even deciding, I haven't written any music yet, but I'm just trying to assemble the raw material. Then I will sit behind the modular and I try not to, it can be a time suck. I mean, you could spend weeks just fiddling, but I'll spend a day or two using those tempo grids to clock elements in the modular to create percussion elements and weird little glitchy sounds that have a rhythmic nature. That's generally what I use the modular for, is to create rhythmic little pulses and things, which I can then manipulate using Ableton Live or other processes to get them to fit to a piece of music that as it develops. And in terms of what's my favorite piece of studio gear, I'd say lately, I recently got the Waldorf Quantum synthesizer, which is sort of the sum total of 20 or 30 years of Waldorf's experience at designing digital synths and wavetable synths and even analog filters and so on. So it's a kind of a greatest hits of 30 years of Waldorf digital synth insanity. And some people might say, yeah, but you could do all that with plugins. Well, kind of, maybe, but there is some esoteric kind of euphonic quality to the sound of the Quantum. Even if you just dump a sample in from the computer and just play the sample, it comes out of the Quantum sounding just a little kind of scoopier and shinier and woofier and better. And it has a knob on it that's a compressor, that's a one knob compressor right next to the volume knob. And it's just proven to be you could score an entire sci-fi film just with that. So I love the Waldorf Quantum, and that's my favorite goodie that I've gotten in the past couple of years.
Now, so many of your scores deal with the idea of madness. And now that, thank God, we seem to be seeing an actual light at the end of this tunnel. How has your quarantine experience been creatively? Did it actually help? Or?
I do feel guilty because it didn't wreck my world in the way that it wrecked the worlds of people in the record industry or in the live performing touring crowd. And even on a lot of other film composers who have bigger setups, bigger infrastructure, and maybe bigger staff. And I'm sure it affected orchestral recording, because imagine, a 70-piece orchestra all sitting in the room together. And how do you play a clarinet with a mask on? I'm not sure if that's possible. So, but for me, since my studio is at my house and sort of in a guest house next to the place, I wasn't, and I don't have a big staff of interns and assistants that have to come over every day to help me turn everything on or whatever. So it didn't really affect the texture of my life. And it strangely provided a little, a kind of a bit of a respite from the mayhem, that it was kind of okay to be just sat in the studio for days on end, fiddling with stuff, because that's what everyone worldwide was doing. So it was actually kind of a creative, it was kind of a boon, because it let me not feel as guilty as I normally would to sit and fiddle with the modular for 3 days in a row and only come out of it with, 5 minutes of recordings.
Now, the great Mr. Y is back with a good question. What is your favorite Saw movie and why? Or Saw score and why?
They all have special places in my heart. But I think on Saw 2, that was kind of more fun than some of them, partly because it was this, when the Saw franchise became this surprise hit and they were kind of ramping up, they were like, hey, we're doing another one. Obviously before it was like, we're doing another one every year for 7 straight years. So when the word came out that we were going to do Saw 2, it was kind of like, well, we need to ramp up we're going to have to up the ante a bit. And of course, obviously there was more elaborate trap sequences, and it was not such a small claustrophobic world on the screen. And that one was a lot of fun for me, because it was the first time I was sort of revisiting some of the material that I'd done kind of in a hurry on the first one, but also because I was able to work with a few collaborators who I've worked with before on other contexts and whose work I love, especially Wes Borland. Yes, he's a guitar player in Limp Bizkit, I know, but his guitar work, his riffology, and his sonic experimentation is otherworldly. And I think he's one of the top. I put him up there with people like Adrian Belew, because even though maybe those talents are not as evident in the context of like Limp Bizkit as they are in his solo work and in other stuff that he does, he's a supremely talented sonic experimenter and an extremely skilled guitar player. And I had, as I was saying before, I would have like these wireframe structures of cues, and I would say, do you have any ideas for this scene? And I would play it for him, and he would just start playing these tapping guitar patterns that sounded like weird woodblock percussion or stuff. So that was a great experience because we had the kind of time to experiment. And in some of the later sequels, they were again done in a hurry. Sometimes like the schedule was so compressed that a lot of times I didn't have the time to experiment in the way that I did on Saw 2. So that one's kind of special for me.
Now, Ryan Atkins would like to know, do you ever use outboard gear on the box sounds?
Oh, yeah. Primarily, I still do have a decent collection of hardware synths, some of which are old favorites from the golden era, things like the Prophet VS and the Oberheim Expander and the sort of old favorites. But and I do have a decent selection of outboard gear. Most of the sort of rack outboard gear is used on the recording process when I'm capturing the sounds that I'll then later manipulate in the box. So I do have things like a Crane Song Spider, which is an 8-channel mic pre, and also a mixer that lets me mic up drums with 6 or 8 mics and commit to a stereo mix right there on the spot and record it as a stereo mix instead of recording each channel individually. Also have some kind of wacky processors like the UBK Fatso, which is an Empirical Labs Fatso compressor that's been modified and painted brown by the guys at UBK and Cush Audio. And it's sort of like, I call it the Portishead box, because you can get that Beatles / Portishead ultra compressed type of sounds very quickly and easily with that. Then the third kind of category is all the guitar mania. And I do have a insane collection of guitar pedals, but I try to limit it to 48. And I have them all wired up on pull-out shelves, and they're all powered up and wired up into patch bays so that I can quickly experiment without sitting on the floor cross-legged with a handful of 9-volt batteries and a screwdriver, changing batteries and pedals and stuff. They're all powered up and wired up so that as I'm working on guitar textures and weird guitar drones, I can just experiment through all different pedal chains. And that's been a great kind of creative sandbox to play in.
One thing that really impressed me about the score for Spiral is, it's actually quite melodic. When you really get to hear the music, shine on its sun, it's actually a quite, melodic score. I mean, there's some kick-ass metal guitar that really hits at the ending. But again, it's quite a different beast, as it were, which kind of goes to our next question from Pasquiandra from Belgium. Given again this kind of orchestral shine on, or that sense of sonic quality, could you ever see yourself after this horrible thing is gone, or people are now hitting the clubs again? I mean, would you want to do the Saw tour with an orchestra?
That would, the logistics of something like that would be just, I can't even imagine. But if someone came to me and said, hey, I produced Ramin's Game of Thrones concert tour, and I produced Hans Zimmer's concert tour, I could produce your tour and make it so you don't have to lose your mind trying to figure out what part everyone should play. I'm not opposed to the idea, but mounting such a mission on my own is like, oh my God, the logistics and trying to decompile and arrange these pieces of music that were created with, weird sound. Like, how do you translate that weird bowed metal mayhem into like a violin part? I'm not sure, but I'd leave it at sure, I'd do it if I had some outside help.
I mean, I'll tell you that the Game of Thrones concert, especially if you got to see it in Inglewood, was the most amazing live concert I've ever seen in my life.
It's got to be an epic. And apparently, I saw on live stream Hans Zimmer's concert tour from a couple years ago, and that was equally and that's after watching those, that's part of why I think, oh my God, I can't even imagine doing that. That's like the logistics involved is insane.
Now, I mean, I just have to love how this movie, the end's got a lot of controversy. I actually kind of like just how it just ends like that. Where do you see this guy going? And the score's going with him. I assume we're going to see a return of this person. I'm really glad that they've made this movie as kind of a side street from the main Saw storyline. So now they can continue, if they want to, the producers and writers can continue down this side alley without kind of affecting what plans they may have for the primary Saw universe. And I don't know anything definite yet, but I would imagine, given the warm reception that Spiral has had, I can only imagine that the producers and the studio are thinking, okay, how would we approach a Spiral 2 or a Spiral 3? And then separate to that, okay, what's next for the main Saw street, the big street? So I would imagine they've got grand plans. All I know is that I'm super glad that the producers, Mark Berg and Oren Koulis have been, they've been extremely faithful to me, and they're like, you're our guy. And I'm like, thank you. So whatever happens, I'm sure I will be, I'll put it this way, they'll have to pry this franchise from my cold, dead hands and put them on the poster. But, I would imagine they have grand plans for not only the side street of Spiral, but for the main Jigsaw Saw Avenue. So, stay tuned. I'm sure there'll be more. I mean, absolutely. I can't imagine it.
Yeah.
So I'm hearing the subway train approaching. I'm still got a tongue to talk with. So I've got one last question for you.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at, where you started with Saw and where you're at right now with Spiral, how do you think the Saw franchise and with all the incredible stuff in between it, how do you think it shows how your music has grown and you have grown as a composer?
Well, it's kind of a double-edged sword, because as I'm compiling, like a year or two ago, we did a Saw anthology, which had sort of 20 minutes worth of music from each of the 8 at the time movies. And as I was comparing them all together, I kept going back to the music on the first film, which was much more simplistic and minimalistic and kind of stripped down. And, there were moments when I was listening to stuff from like the movies in the middle of the franchise and going, the hell was I thinking? The first one was, I had it right on the first one. And then I went down all these weird avenues, and there's these Gothic choirs. Why was I doing that? But again, it was all in response to the images I'm seeing on the screen and the director's visual style. So I'm always glad that they're keeping the styles on the visual side changing, so that I can follow that as it twists and turns through different weird cul-de-sacs.
Well, Charlie, I want to thank you for playing our game at Film Music Live. It was a very interesting game today. Well, I want you all to watch Spiral in theaters. You can go back to theaters if you've been vaccinated. And Charlie Clouser's score is going to be available on Lakeshore Records this Friday, the 21st. And I want to give a big shout out to Dale Turner, Mark Northam, Mark Banning, Kathy Ing, and the team at Lakeshore Records. And I will see you all on the next Film Music Live. Thanks, Charlie.
Thanks, everyone.